Hi. Hello. Thank you for those who have stayed. It's very lovely to see that there's still some people here at 4 on the last day of Devconnect. So now we'll have a final section on innovation, and there will be 2 talks. The first one will be Oskar from the Ethereum Foundation, who I'll introduce properly in a second. And then the second one will be Austin Adams, who is a researcher formerly at Uniswap and now at his own company called Whetstone Research. I'm very excited for this one because it's more innovation-driven, more research, which is closer to my heart. And we'll start off with Oskar, who is the Institutional Privacy Task Force team lead at the Ethereum Foundation, telling us what privacy demands institutions have from Ethereum. Please give a big round of applause.
Hi, everyone. Last day of Devconnect. Glad you guys are all still hanging in there. So my name is Oskar. I'm leading the IPTF team at the Ethereum Foundation. So it stands for the Institutional Privacy Task Force, and I co-lead it together with Mo. It's a new team, and I'm going to talk to you about institutional privacy on Ethereum. There's 3 takeaways I want you guys to have from this talk. The first is that institutions, they do want privacy on Ethereum. It's like the main blocker right now. And the second thing is in terms of understanding what these institutions actually need. And in that direction, we're building this open privacy market map of the space to sort of understand this better. And the third thing is that you can sort of contribute to this effort and help shape this. So first of all, why does this matter? Like, why do we care about institutional privacy? There's a few reasons, right? But like, I think a very big one is just obviously these are like massive, massive markets. We're talking like in the trillions of dollars. And they do want access to these like public rails and open interoperability that Ethereum provides. And it used to be the case that regulation or regulatory clarity was the main blocker. If you've been in the space for a while, you know that a few years ago it was like that was like a no-starter for a lot of these institutions. But nowadays, and especially this year, privacy is actually the main blocker. And it's kind of not default for these kind of multi-stakeholder flows, where it's not just sort of Alice sending something to Bob, but you also have things like regulators and like custodians and all of these other sort of parties that has to have sort of some kind of privacy invariance that have to be kept. So what about demand from when it comes to institutional privacy? So institutions are actively exploring and building on Ethereum. And when we look at Ethereum, there's obviously like stablecoins and real-world assets and DeFi that's dominating. And that's like one of the reasons. It used to be, right, that regulatory uncertainty was a critical blocker, but nowadays it's privacy. And that's sort of what is stopping them from building on Ethereum. How can we onboard institutions? Like, what does it mean to onboard institutions? And I guess, like, why should we care about this? If you look at, for example, like fixed income markets, like $115 market, and cross-border payments is like mind-boggling, like $1 quadrillion a year. And more globally, billions of users use some kind of formal payment methods, like 80% of the population. And if you look at on-chain activity, it's definitely significant, but it's basically a rounding error compared to these more mature markets. Like $300 billion stablecoins in terms of market cap. Real-world assets was around 30 billion. It's gone up a little bit since then. And this is like a screenshot that you can see from institutions.ethereum.org that sort of shows sort of the dominance when it comes to Ethereum usage. Actually, this has changed a little bit. So the last week or so, there's been more usage by, for example, Canton when it comes to real-world assets. And I think this sort of points to how a single institution can sort of tip the scale. You should take those numbers with a bit of grain of salt. But the point here is that we're trying to set sort of the defaults for the next decade or so, and privacy. If we sort of enable privacy, we're not going to get these like massive monetary inflows that are possible. Leverage and impact. So just getting like 1% penetration of traditional finance would sort of move like real volume, and you would be able to increase real-world assets with like 10 or 100x. And just having a single major institution would touch millions of end users. And this is like not hypothetical. There's like various pilot and production rails that are already announced, and there's a lot more that's sort of going on and will be announced over the next 6 to 12 months. There's a lot of overlap here with another initiative at the Ethereum Foundation, which is a $1 trillion security initiative, which is basically like how can we create infrastructure that sort of can meaningfully secure $1 trillion. So that could either be a billion users with $1,000 each, or it could be like 1,000 contracts with $1 billion locked up each. And we have like massive leverage here, and the time is very much now in terms of sort of providing these kind of affordances when it comes to institutions. Why do institutions want privacy? So unlike sort of the roots of sort of crypto and Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on, this is not like a philosophical or moral question for them. It's very much about bottom line impact here. So in terms of like pricing and execution and counterparty risk, especially when they're sort of doing larger transactions, like you don't necessarily want to leak that because you can get front run, and this is like measurably will impact the bottom line. Another reason is obviously like compliance. They are operating, all institutions are operating in like a regulatory environment, regardless of what jurisdiction that might be, and they need to be compliant with their local laws and regulation. This also ties into the idea of like operational certainty and familiarity, because these large institutions, they already have product market fit. They've been operating for decades, and they're extremely mature and know what they are doing in sort of the business sense and also the legal sense. And they basically want to take all of that institutional knowledge and mental models and basically port it on top of public blockchains. And that means that you have to sort of find a way to map these two very, very different worlds. And finally, a big one is also in terms of strategic confidentiality. So a lot of institutions, they don't want to leak sort of the positions or monetary flows or kind of intentions. Like if you buy a bond or transfer it or so on, and it's like a $50 million, you don't necessarily want to leak that to your competitors. And the same thing if you're doing something when it comes to supply chains, that's like a competitive advantage. How does institutional privacy differ from kind of, I guess, more individual privacy? So there's a few ways they differ. One major one is that there are often many actors. So it's not just about like Alice sending some money to Bob. It's when one institution gets onboarded, it will have sort of a massive impact on all of their users. And it can even be like an end-to-end relationship when we talk about something like private trades. If you imagine like a stock exchange running on top of Ethereum, then it would be like even more complex interactions. Another big difference is that there's very, very high cost of violations. Like for example, if you as an individual buy a cup of coffee, you might care a little bit about privacy and so on, but in terms of the mental overhead, it's very, very different from an institution that's maybe doing like a $10 million deal or so, where that will like have a measurable impact, right? So the cost of violation can be measured in terms of dollar value. And obviously auditability is mandatory as well. The way institutions think about privacy is like not the same as opacity. It's more about having some kind of scoped visibility of like who learns what, when, and under what specific circumstances. So like how can you control and fine tune that? When we think about like institutional demand, you can sort of compare like public versus private rails. And a big reason why a lot of institutions want to move to sort of public networks like Ethereum is because of access to like things like liquidity, sensor persistence, like 10 years of uptime, and ultimately being kind of like a selling point, if you will, for the space, as well as all the network effects that come with it in terms of users and dev tooling and other types of like block exports and all of these types of things, right? There are alternatives like private and consortium chains, and they exist, but they kind of limit composability and interoperability, and they can pose some kind of risk for these institutions that sort of are used to operating with very mature partners or on very sort of neutral infrastructure. But in order for these institutions to actually move to Ethereum, the ecosystem as a whole need to satisfy these institutional privacy requirements on public infrastructure. So how do we do that? Well, we need to understand exactly what those requirements are. And it leads into this work we've been doing in terms of the institutional privacy map. And just briefly, a little bit about our team. So IPTF, we're a new team at the Ethereum Foundation. It's been around for like 2 or 3 months. So it's an institutional privacy task force. And what we're trying to do is helping institutions build on top of Ethereum. It's a very small team, focused team, has like business leads, technical architects, and researchers, and it's kind of a collaboration between the enterprise team and the EcoDev cluster at EF, as well as the privacy cluster under EF, with a sort of more focus on more the technical R&D side of things. And what we do is we do things like workshops and various like deep dives, and we collaborate with institutions as well as vendors in the space, and basically trying to demystify the space. Because what ends up happening is that you have these major institutions, and they get approached by other products with very mature BD function, and they get told certain things, but it's hard for them to know to what extent they should take that at face value and so on. And I also want to point out that these institutions, some of them, they don't know a lot, and there's like a lot of education involved, but others are extremely sophisticated. They might have like an R&D team that's been operating for many years, and they have like 20 people and so on. So they differ a lot in terms of maturity. But in general, what they want is some kind of guidance, and that's like one role we're playing at EF and IPTF in terms of sort of surfacing these truths and explaining what exists in the ecosystem and how they should think about privacy and so on. And the ultimate goal here, right, is that we're trying to onboard institutions onto Ethereum and providing privacy that's performant, secure, usable, and accessible, specifically with a focus on institutions. So how do we work? So this is sort of not, we sat down and thought about some cool ideas of like, oh, here's how enterprises or institutions can use Ethereum. These are like real world validated use cases. These are some of the largest institutions in the world that we talk to, and they tell us exactly what they want and sort of the conditions around that. And the various constraints can be sort of business related. They can be when it comes to like legal requirements, if they operate in specific jurisdictions. It can also be on the operational side and how they look at that. And we basically take those real world requirements and business use cases, and we try to sort of open source as much of it as possible to sort of show to the ecosystem what these requirements are. And what we also do is like distill these kind of patterns. So these are reusable building blocks when it comes to how to get these kind of privacy guarantees on Ethereum. And you can think of these patterns as like you can combine them and then create, we call it like approaches, so end-to-end composition. So how do you address a specific business use case? If it's, for example, like tokenizing, like issuing a bond and then trading around it, how do you even think about that problem? And what are the building blocks that are needed for it? And then we deliver things like private specifications and kind of guidance playbooks and POCs. And what we're trying to do is like keep this public reference open, while at the same time, having some other context when it comes to these institutions, because they come to us and tell us certain things, and they want to be able to talk to us openly. And we try to sort of, as much as possible, we try to open source it so that other people in the ecosystem can see where the real demand is from institutions. And this leads to sort of the first artifact that we've been working on. So this is the institutional privacy map. And what we're trying to do is kind of frame the problem and like understanding where do these like privacy leaks occur. And then what we do is we have the problem space and sort of explaining what those problems are, but then we are routing that to specific solutions. So those like patterns and approaches, as well as vendors. So like kind of turnkey solutions or kind of businesses that solve these problems in some specific way. And that also includes like understanding the maturity of them, like how they perform and so on. And as I mentioned, the methodology is like very much based on validated use cases from major institutions. And we are aware of like many more use cases, but we try to focus on the ones that we heard from multiple institutions, sort of to focus the conversation a little bit. And they have a very specific set of requirements, whether it's technical or legal or operational and so on. And the ultimate goal is we want to sort of provide these playbooks and guidance to help these institutions make better decisions when it comes to building on Ethereum, specifically with a focus on privacy. Another thing we're doing is trying to surface sort of areas where more work is needed. So there are definitely certain blind spots that the ecosystem has in terms of how to think about privacy at scale. And we want to surface at the ecosystem so there's an opportunity for everyone here and the ecosystem at large to address them so that institutions have confidence when it comes to building on Ethereum. It's very much a work in progress, both in terms of coverage as well as depth, and feedback is definitely welcome. So in terms of how we structure it, we have these like use cases. So these are business problems with these specific requirements. And then we have these patterns, so reusable technical building blocks. These can be like specifications or kind of cryptographic primitives or ways of doing things. And then we have approaches, which are sort of recommendations around like end-to-end solutions and how you combine these technologies together. And then we also have things like details on jurisdictions. And these are like, for example, like regulatory frameworks or compliance guidelines. And they differ a lot. So it's very different in the US versus EU versus Japan or Hong Kong. And we try to capture that because it's really just like another set of requirements that you have to think about. We also have a documentation when it comes to domains. So we're focused initially a bit more on financial institutions, but there's also other domains when it comes to governments and NGOs and enterprises. And these type of domains are things like payments or custody or trading, and it basically reflects the actual like internal logic of these massive institutions and how they think about their business verticals. And then finally, we have vendors. So that's kind of neutral tooling documentation. So we've been talking to a lot of the biggest sort of privacy vendors in the space and understanding sort of where they fit into their like what they kind of capabilities they have, what's the maturity, how do they perform, and so on, with the idea of sort of ultimately being useful to these institutions. And how you navigate, it depends like a lot of what type of decision maker or role you have. So like if you're on the more business side, you might start with sort of business use cases and then look at specific jurisdictions that are relevant to you, and then finally look at how you might solve them with specific approaches. Whereas if you're more on the technical side, so you're on the research or engineering side, you might start looking at sort of bottom up in terms of specific patterns or specifications, and then see how those are combined into approaches. And then finally look at vendors and like maybe there's like a gap, like no one has figured out how to combine these two ERCs together in a way that actually solves a real world problem. And finally, if you're on the legal compliance side, you might start at like the jurisdiction and see, okay, does this actually capture the legal frameworks and constraints I'm operating under? And maybe there's something missing. Or to the extent it's already documented, you want to tie that back to the use case and then look at, for example, how should we think about disclosure mechanisms from a legal point of view? Taking a step back, if you think about sort of the life cycle of these things, you can see like where does leakage happen? And one way you can look at it is like pre-trade, so in terms of like intents or exposing order flow and how you address that. And now this is in terms of the settlement layer. So you don't want to necessarily link who is making a transaction to the amount or the type of transaction. And there's also things like principal risk. So there's a concept called DVP or PVP, so deliver versus payment. And basically the idea is that when you do a delivery of some kind of asset, the payment of that asset has to happen at the same time in an atomic fashion. And you might think, well, this is a smart contract, but that's not actually how it works, because what you end up with is that you have these different networks. So you might have like a clearinghouse, a completely different network that's off-chain, and you need to have this atomic invariant that the delivery happens at the same time as the payment. So this is like a strictly higher requirement than you might see in the traditional crypto-native world, for example, with bridging and so on. And it's basically like a business requirement in terms of how to think about risk, but also a legal requirement that you need to make sure delivery versus happens at the same time as payment, even though it's happening on two completely different networks. And you also want to do it on in a privacy-preserving fashion. When we think about post-trade, there's also things like you don't want to leak positions or notes kind of visibility, but at the same time you want to have some kind of audit needs. So you do want to provide certain information to certain regulatory bodies and so on. And that, again, differs depending on specific jurisdiction. So current status, use cases, as I mentioned, we have a handful documented. We are aware of many more, but we have sort of some basics in place. Approaches, similar. We have sort of an initial kind of spike in terms of how to approach them. Patterns, similar. We have sort of some things covered, but there's definitely more work to be done. And when it comes to vendors, we have spent the last few weeks talking to, I think, 50 or to 100 vendors or so, to sort of try to capture the sort of hive mind that is the Ethereum ecosystem and document it in a way so we can sort of see what are the capabilities of the Ethereum ecosystem as a whole. And this is something we definitely need feedback and contributions on as well to make sure we're actually providing an accurate view to institutions. We think about like patterns to solutions. So as I mentioned, these patterns are these kind of reusable building blocks. So it can be things like commitments, or how, like a specification for dealing with atomic DVP, or how do you deal with scoped viewing keys, and so on. And an approach is how you would combine these different patterns to solve a specific business use case. And this is like a short talk, so I won't have any time to go deep, but I just want to cover like a few topics at a very high level. So those are private broadcasting, private bonds, both sort of issues and trading, and then payments, and then trade settlement. So when it comes to private transaction broadcasting, the goal is that you're trying to reduce pre-trade leakage. So these are dealing with things like front running or MEV or leaking of strategies. And the way you might approach that is, for example, with encrypted or private lanes or some kind of OTC submission. And you might also have sort of some private roll-up execution here. And why it matters is because institutions often want sort of better execution quality while at the same time preserving composability. When it comes to private bonds, it's sort of both the issue side and the trading side. And the problem here is that you want to have some kind of confidential bond deals with a short settlement. And this composes things like shielded transfers, as well as the atomic DVP I mentioned before, and selective disclosure. And here you might, for example, mint on L1, but then you would do trading privately on L2 and these type of constructs. An outcome is ultimately you have some kind of compliant confidentiality, but still deterministic finality in terms of these bonds being settled, because it has big implications when it comes to liquidity. Private payments, so what you want here is kind of stakeholder-only visibility. And stakeholders here are not just sort of Alice sending something to Bob. It also includes, for example, custody providers or regulators. And regulators and auditors also need some kind of access when it's required. And you can deal with this, for example, when it comes to shielded balances, with shielded balances and transfers and some scoped viewing, and optionally also like things like PVP or DVP when you're doing cross-border transfers. So payment versus payment when you're actually transferring money across currencies and across borders. And why it matters is because you want to have kind of operational privacy without having some kind of black box accounting. So you need some way of accounting for these things, including for external stakeholders. Also, a thing I want to mention on the private payments is that it might sound simple, what you just send from one address to another, but if you look at these payment this payment infrastructure and networks, how they actually work under hood, they're extremely complex. There's many networks and there's different custodians and different rules and ways of dealing with this. So it's definitely not trivial, and there's like, you can read books about how this infrastructure works. I also want to point out that it's very different what type of use case we're talking about here, because it's one thing if you have a sort of limited set of institutions sending like $10 million to each other, and it's like a known thing, versus if you, for example, do a retail stablecoin for 100 million users. Those are sort of very different use cases that both touch on payments, but they also have implications in terms of the design and specific requirements and how you would think about designing that. When it comes to private trade settlement, the goal is you want to sort of minimize the linkage here, again, and reduce operations friction. And it might touch on things like bonds or real-world assets, tokenization, derivatives, and so on. And there's lots of ways you can deal with this. For example, you can batch proofs of commitments. You have some kind of neutral settlement venue, like L1, and you want to have some kind of auditable logs for after the fact. And it matters because you want to have these kind of predictable cycles and clear reconciliation. And this, again, is very important for large institutions in terms of how to think about settlement and reducing those times and still having certainty that you're not going to sort of lose your money somehow. And one way to think about this mapping effort is kind of like a decision path. So you might start by identifying the use case, like what is the actual business problem you're trying to solve. And then you would apply jurisdictional constraints. Sort of what is the regulation that I am under and that's sort of constraining me. And then you will select specific patterns or approaches and sort of like what specific building blocks you're using. And then you might evaluate vendors, like what tools exist, what's the maturity, what's the performance of them. And then you would sort of do these pilots, right, and learn from them. And then you can sort of iterate on that. And most of these paths are incomplete, and that's where you would love it if people in the ecosystem want help out with it. And this is something that a lot of people have already done. So where we're headed, we're sort of increasing the coverage across multiple domains, because there's a lot of things going on here in the traditional finance market, but also across other like identity systems with governments and so on. And we're trying to sort of go deeper on patterns and approaches runbooks. So basically, having more confidence that the things we recommend are actually things that ultimately solve institutions' problems. And what we're trying to do is create these kind of shared playbooks and best practices for Ethereum privacy when it comes to institutions. So just to summarize, institutions want privacy on Ethereum. In fact, it's like the main blocker right now. And we're building this open shared privacy map of the space. And finally, you can contribute. So PRs and issues are open. And yeah, feel free to come talk to us. We have a GitHub repo. You can scan the QR code that leads to the market map. Also have a very bare bones website and a Twitter account. And you can contribute things like patterns or approaches or vendor notes. And yeah, come talk to us. Bring real constraints and feedback. And that's it for me. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Oskar. I'm coming from behind, and I'll ask you the questions. They've been put into by the audience on the QR code. So the first one is, what is the geographical distribution of institutions that you may talk to at the IPTF? And are there any institutions in LATAM?
That's a good question. I would say a lot of them it's a mix of like APAC, Europe, and US right now, roughly equal. We have had some initial contacts with sort of LATAM, but not super deep yet. So that's something that we would like to go deeper into as well, yes.
Okay, cool. Then we have two more questions. The first one is the market map that you've made useful for institutions that want to operate on the L1, or also for those that want to operate on L2s?
That's a good question. It's useful for both. So we've had workshops with institutions where they're trying to solve some specific business use case, and they ask us a bunch of questions, including how to think about L1 and L2. And this touches on things like, you know, what are the additional affordances I get with a privacy L2? How should I think about data availability and risk around that? How should we think about L2 governance? And so on. So it's very much an open design space, and I think different institutions will make different choices depending on sort of what the actual requirements are. And what we are trying to do is just explain those trade-offs and those properties in a way that they can make informed decisions.
Yeah, that makes also sense. And then the final question that we have here is, are the different privacy vendors composable with each other?
That's also a good question. So I think that's also why we put a lot of emphasis on patterns and specifications, because as you know, in the Ethereum ecosystem, we have EIPs and ERCs, and you have similar efforts in sort of the CK space as well. So ideally, yes, but unfortunately, not all of them are composable. There are certain tricks you can do, but I think in general, that's definitely a hard problem. In general, I would say that what we want are sort of common standards so you can have interoperability, but in practice it's also quite difficult, I would say.
That makes also sense. Well, thank you very much. Let's thank Oskar one more time.
Thank you.